No, it's okay. All right, so we have started the webinar and people are popping in.
Cool.
Welcome everybody. Just take a seat and let everybody file in. And I'm just going to look for Robert's name here and then promote him. Okay, yes, there's Robert. Robert, I see you. I'm going to promote you to panelist. You've been promoted, sir. Well deserved. I'll make him a co-host as well, with all the powers and privileges that come with that.
Hey. Use it wisely.
Hey, yeah, use it wisely, Robert. Don't abuse it. All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to get started here. There's still some people filing in, but I think we're mostly ready.
James, we got
Thank you.
Classroom of stuff here, people here, just to let you know.
Oh, there's a whole class.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a real class with real people in it, James. So, thank you. Which is weird because there's also virtual people. So it's this weird sort of mix. It's a hybrid. Thank you. Welcome. This is the third talk in the 2022 Sara Turnbull Visiting Designer Lecture Series, where we talk to various people in the world of design, art, philosophy, activism, science. And today we're really excited to talk to a biologist because it's probably the most natural choice of people to talk to with a design group should talk to biologists about climate change, as climate change affects pretty much every aspect of every ecosystem on Earth, which James is going to talk about today. With me, as always, is Robert Wortzberg. He's artist and provocateur who is teaching this class in climate design that this lecture series is running in conjunction with. This class pairs science students with art students to come up with a holistic installation design that bridges this gap between science and art. Still to be decided what that's going to look like, but that's why we're talking to James in part to kind of get an idea about how biology plays a role in this. As always, if you have questions, comments during the lecture, please use the Q&A. It's at the very bottom of your screen. It's distinct from the chat. The chat's where we kind of talk and have fun, which is also permitted. But the Q&A is like formally, if you have a real question, that's the best way to ask it so that I can kind of manage the questions at hand. So Robert and I are very excited to welcome our guest today, Dr. James Lindemeer. He's an associate curator at the New York Botanical Garden, which is right down the road. He's the assistant professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, so go CUNY. He's originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he became fascinated with the interplay between human activities, biodiversity, and the natural world at an early age. He studied biology as an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, and then he obtained a PhD at, again, CUNY, so yay. He has devoted his career to studying lichens, collaborative fungi that form dynamic and beautiful symbioses with algae, as well as a host of other microbes. Is it fungi or fungi? Which do you prefer?
It's however you would prefer to say it.
I'm going to say fungi. Yeah, I just said fungi, so I'll say it again. Like many fungi, lichens are hubs of essential biological and environment activities in land-based ecosystems. Understanding these fungi and their response to change offers unique perspectives on both ourselves, the current ecosystem crisis more broadly. And I was just in Philly, and I really love that city. I fell in love with it again. And we went to the Franklin Institute, which has a lot to do with physics. There's a lot of physics-based stuff there, but there's also like a whole biological wing. And it came away with a ton of ideas, like installation design ideas, but it's a really great city. So thanks for coming.
With a great arts scene and a great, natural history and science goes back, and the arts go back centuries.
It's unbelievable. It really is. I was really impressed. So anyway, welcome. Thank you so much, James, for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks. You missed the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, which is just down the block from there. I used to work there.
I did. I missed that. That's unfortunate. Next time in Philly.
It's pretty great as well. The Franklin Institute is also near and dear to my heart. I've been going there since a small child.
I was blown away. I was blown away. We went there for the Harry Potter exhibit, And then we wound up, I was looking at everything else and it was just unbelievable. So
do they still have that giant heart that you can walk through?
They have the heart.
So.
They do.
It left a massive impression on me as a kid.
We were about to walk out, and then my son turned left and he saw the heart and he was like, "Oh, can we go on that?" I'm like, "Yes." And then we spent like another 2 hours there. Unbelievable time. So great.
Are they still splitting 2x4s with lightning bolts?
I didn't see that.
Oh.
I missed that. I missed that.
You have to go back now.
Yeah, I gotta go back.
Institute.
I have to go back.
Who knew that this would be an unpaid plug for the Franklin Institute?
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Great. Anyway, so you wanted to show us some stuff, and you have a presentation here. Why don't you launch into it?
Sure. Cool. Thanks. So, thanks again. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming, attending today online or in person online, as the case may be. It's just like a perfect example of how everything is right now. It would have been so much more fun if this was in person. That's what I personally really enjoy, but being online at least opens the possibility for more people to attend. So when Robert asked me to present as part of this lecture series, it was in the context of Mycorrhizae, which are fungi, which I am decidedly not an expert in. Nonetheless, I thought this was really an exciting opportunity to kind of step back and place my work and the work of so many others into a much bigger construct of global diversity, biological processes, and anthropogenic change. So let's get started. So I personally have always been in love with the natural world. Even as a kid in Philadelphia, I was curious about the plants and the animals around me, whether in the inner city where I grew up, where I lived, or in rural Maryland, where my mother's family was from, or in rural Germany, where my father's family was from. It just seems to me that regardless of who you are and where you are, so that's everyone in attendance here, it's impossible not to wonder why the natural world is organized the way that it is, what the forces are that underlie the patterns that we see in nature, what accounts for the species that grow in a forest, or the diversity and abundance of, say, epiphytes like ferns, mosses, and lichens that grow on a single tree. Our perspective of life on Earth, nature, and ourselves has changed really dramatically over time. And increasingly, we understand that living things are interconnected with each other and their environments in elegant and yet completely unfathomable complexity. So, a chaos of countless events and interactions have assembled the world around us. Life on Earth, Earth itself, and even the whole of the universe has been shaped by patterns and processes that play out over scales largely imperceptible to us. One can ask, what is time? Change has always been constant. Global ecosystems have always been dynamic. Yet the remarkable forms and frameworks in the natural world, as we perceive them, reflect the long game, the infinitesimal of geologic time. This is hard for us as humans to conceptualize because it means that what appears to be immutable and static is quite starkly the opposite. For instance, the long view requires us to understand that 20,000 years ago, the Earth was much colder than it is today, and glaciers pushed well south of their current bounds, disrupting communities of plants and animals, forcing life to move and to adapt. As the glaciers retreated north and the climate changed again, species of more northern areas had to migrate up the mountains of Appalachia to survive at latitudes well south of where they otherwise could today. That's why when we look at mountaintop boulder fields in a place like Virginia, we find that in sheltered, protected nooks and crannies, there are species that occur much further, or would otherwise occur, much further north in boreal areas and in Arctic areas. So indeed, our perceptive or our perceived present has been assembled over these amazing grand scales and unfolded from millennia of effectively chaos and chance. So life and ecosystems reflect the coalescence of time. The mountain forests of Appalachia, they developed over hundreds of millions of years. Palm hammocks on the Atlantic coast reflect tropical species at their northern extremes, remnants of a much, much warmer past. Their sluggish swamps and bays, which have developed to withstand and monopolize dramatic changes in water level and flow. While change has been constant, the pace and scale of change has increased rapidly with the development of what many here would conceptualize as modern society, its technologies and attitudes. We've precipitated and created dramatic changes, disrupting, altering, even creating relationships between individual organisms, populations, species, and communities. Introduced pathogens, decimate keystone species. Air pollution and acid rain damage organisms and change the chemistry of ecosystems. Resource extraction, such as logging, extirpates sensitive species, while new and unusual fire regimes create challenges even for species adapted to burning. Extensive monocultures replace productive biodiverse ecosystems supported by altered hydrology and chemical applications. Wetlands are ditched and drained while rising seas inundate and saltwater intrudes into fresh and brackish areas. Severe storms erode and alter the coastline. Nature is undergoing a fundamental reorganization driven directly and indirectly by us. This isn't to say that there are not many extreme and rapid events in Earth's history. Volcanic explosions, massive wildfires, flooding, and impacts with extraterrestrial objects, those have all happened in the past. But it's clear that change is now happening at unprecedented scale and in unprecedented ways that are starkly perceptible to us in a single human lifetime. I suspect that everyone here already knows that life on Earth is remarkably diverse. There are hundreds of thousands of plant species, millions of animal and fungal species. That only begins to touch on this sort of dizzying array, the dizzying universe of microbes and viruses around us. There's whole universes of life. And each species is made up of a population with varying numbers of individuals. Historically, we thought of and studied species and individuals essentially in isolation. So you can imagine that as a taxidermied animal in a bell jar in a museum, maybe like the Franklin Institute, like you referred to earlier. But now we know that nothing exists in isolation and that interactions between and among organisms, as well as their environments and other non-living things, are what drive everything in the world around us. Moreover, the occurrence, diversity, and abundance of organisms is not driven by any single factor, but instead by vast suites of them intermingled with time. It's not just predator and prey, plant and pollinator, but instead it's everything from the internal microbiome to the climate and the soil. Such exponential dimensionality makes perfect sense. But the profound impact that this paradigm shift has really had on science and society, I think, is just difficult to conceptualize and imagine. So biotic interactions are those between and among organisms. These interactions drive much of the world around us. Fungi are the most biologically diverse organisms on Earth. They are literally everywhere, both in diversity and abundance, from deserts to rainforests, old growth forests to cities, on land and in the sea. They are everywhere. They also interact with everything. They are dynamos for essential ecosystem functions. They are made up entirely of tiny threads called hyphae, and they spin shapes that are remarkable, varied, and beautiful, as I think these selected photographs really illustrate. What they do, though, is they effectively knit together the natural world. They transfer nutrients between plants. Some foster growth and creation, others hunt and destroy, still more decompose and recycle. They are pathogens, they're parasites, commensalists, symbionts. They span the possibilities of life. Over the last decade, fungi have emerged into the zeitgeist, in part because of the visionary and transformational work of a small group who recognize their potential. Mycorrhizae are fungi that form intimate relationships with plants. About 80% of the plants on Earth are thought to associate with these fungi. That's a huge
Sorry, James is buffering. Sorry.
Obtained. Oh,
yeah, you buffered just for a little bit.
sorry.
James is on a Wi-Fi, so we just have to expect a couple different hiccups there and there. But you just started talking about mycorrhizae and how
Yep.
they they fit into the larger fungal network, but they have really particular attributes. So go on, continue.
Yeah, sorry about that. That's
no worries.
Institutional Wi-Fi.
Right.
So fungi can obtain the carbohydrates they need through this relationship that they have with plants, and that relationship happens through these sort of connections in, around, and on the roots of the plants. So the fungi can get the carbohydrates that they need through that relationship, and then the plants can get water, minerals, and nutrients that they need, or they can get much more of them than they would otherwise get if the fungi weren't there to help in that process. Those string-like hyphae of the mycorrhizae weave together the natural world, and they really form this amazing, imperceptible, virtually invisible network that just surrounds everything. It's under our feet. Connecting the plants, they connect the plants of the same species and of different species. They shuttle nutrients and signals like data through fiber optic cables. Hopefully they don't have the kind of hiccups that we have here on Wi-Fi. And much of the vegetation on Earth really wouldn't exist without mycorrhizae, and neither would most of our most important agricultural crops. So obviously these things are incredibly important, and they are essential to much of what happens on the planet. Lichens are similar to mycorrhizae. They're another example of fungi that form mutualistic symbioses. However, rather than connecting plants into a sort of botanical internet, lichens associate with algae and cyanobacteria for the purpose of obtaining nutrition. So there's over 20,000 species of lichens known. We actually think there's far more than that. And their unique lifestyle, which involves an internal food source, has allowed them to advance into nearly every available niche on land. They live in the driest deserts and the highest mountains. They form the dominant vegetation in parts of the Arctic, and they were exposed to the vacuum of space by people, but somehow survived unscathed and managed to photosynthesize when they returned to Earth. What else is there to say about lichens? Every tree and rock and square inch of soil should be covered with a blanket of them. In abundance, they regulate humidity and temperature with their sponge-like properties. They provide shelter, food, and camouflage for everything from small insects to caribou. They even play important roles in nutrient cycling. If mycorrhizae are sort of the invisible networks, then lichens are the fungal hubs of action in the natural world that can be readily seen. Sort of like those boxes that you see all over the city where they emanate the Wi-Fi out from and control the traffic lights and distribute the electricity. So botanists would say that the world suffers from plant blindness. That's a type of cognitive bias, a phenomenon wherein one is unable to see or notice or appreciate the plants in one's own environment. If this ailment is endemic, then what do we call the blindness to fungi? Until recently, they were essentially unknown and unappreciated by the average person, this despite everything that they do to keep the natural world functioning. And for us, in the form of pharmaceuticals, recreationals, mind expanders, and food. Even with their recent emergence into the zeitgeist, they are considered essentially unknown and unknowable. Most animals have discrete generations, easily observed as mating, the production of offspring. But plants are also more or less well-defined. Flowers bloom, fruits are produced, and seeds germinate, right? But much of life on Earth lives this rather orderly and linear existence, defined by time points with beginnings and ends. But fungi occupy a completely different hidden dimension. They exist outside of these other sort of more cyclical and linear realms. They occupy the same space as we do, as plants and animals, but they exist beside and effectively around it. So for instance, consider the lichen. Ponder the lichen. Ponder the lichen. We perceive these things as discrete splotches on trees and rocks. They're thought of as static, unchanging, benign, and slow growing. While lichens can be readily seen, their visibility belies internal complexity and hidden diversity. Historically, lichens were largely considered to be monogamous, and homogeneous duos. So one fungus associating with one alga. That's a pretty bland, boring narrative. But what appears to be a single rosette can actually be far more than that. Lichens can be far more than meets the eye. So thanks to advances in DNA sequencing technologies and bioinformatic tools, it's come into focus that lichens are not, in fact, what they seem. What appears to be a single individual may instead contain one or more species and genotypes of photosynthesizing partners, together with a diverse array of microbes that span the full strategies, from symbiotic collaborators to parasites and even harmful pathogens. While there's only one primary fungal species that forms each given lichen, there could be multiple genetically distinct individuals imperceptibly intermingled inside a single rosette. This remarkable dynamic complexity provides exponential dimensionality and explains how such seemingly humble life forms have proved so adept at adapting to change over geologic timescales. Imagine how a variety of partners with differing specializations and degrees of environmental suitability or suitabilities to slightly different environments, temperatures, humidities, things like that. Imagine how having sort of that suite of partners inside of you and available would be quite helpful to adapt to a changing world, albeit maybe a slowly changing one. What is an individual when your perception of an individual can actually contain one or more of your own kind, let alone others? And what is a population when interbreeding individuals can exist intertwined together, but be separated spatially from others on the landscape? If you can't move, how do you find mates? How do you find new partners? You know, this sort of breaks our minds in biology, right? Lichens and fungi in general force us to think about our traditional biological constructs in new and different ways. And then extrapolate out what that means for a community of species. So different species of lichen fungi may associate with the same algae or microbes. Different lichen species growing in close proximity might have similar microbiomes, and partners have more similar microbiomes and partners than two individuals of the same species growing miles away from each other. So that's saying that different species that grow in close proximity may be more similar to each other in their sort of internal composition than two individuals of the same species that grow in quite disparate locations. That's not a huge surprise. I mean, I think anyone that knows about microbiomes would sort of assume that's the case. People that live in similar places have shared microbiomes. But this is really kind of revolutionary in some ways when we try and understand these kinds of organisms that rely upon partners for their survival, for internal food sources and other things that are serving these essential functions inside of them. So it's a paradox of flexibility and specificity, flexible specificity, if you want to call it that. Species and individuals seem flexible, so they're able to associate with suites of relatively closely related algae, but at the same time, they're highly adapted, and those algae are highly adapted to where they live. Suites of lichen species form guilds of shared partners, and they rely on each other for their collective survival. But also they're impacted exponentially then by the loss of a single individual or potentially by the loss of a single species. So this remarkable strategy means that diverse lichen communities with diverse pools of partners and microbiomes reinforce each other and foster even greater diversity. My colleague likes to say lichens beget lichens. But at the same time, they're highly interdependent and they're really highly interconnected. So earlier, I sort of churlishly posed the question, what is time? I feel like that's sort of this retort that we've all come up with as the global pandemic has taken over our lives and unfolded. And other life forms, other biological processes have imposed their will and their timeframes on us. But to me, there's like a deeper, more existential question there. What is time when communities and networks of living things have been assembled over scales that are effectively impossible for us to understand and really conceptualize and conceive? In such a context, time becomes meaningless. It's an abstraction. As we become the arbiters of time, imposing our scales and our perceptions on a world that did not originally conform to them, essentially. Mycorrhizae exemplify how fungi exist outside the order that we've imposed on the world around us. You know, this unseen infrastructure that holds terrestrial ecosystems together, you know, at once conduits for communication and nutrients amongst plants, but also active engineers in the allocation and the sharing of resources in those same ecosystems. There's really fascinating work that's been done now on the communication and signaling in mycorrhizae. The hyphal strings of mycorrhizal networks, they just continue to grow. Cells continue to divide, basically indefinitely, and they endlessly expand and reinforce their own networks. So to a fungus, you know, what is time? What is it really? It's worth asking the question. Take, for instance, though, the lichens growing on a tree in a forest. Imagine the species, this one, the common candle flame lichen, Latin names Candelaria concolor for anyone who cares. Like many lichens, it's evolved specialized mechanisms that allow it to bud and fragment. So a kind of controlled deconstruction wherein the lichen exposes itself and forms these little cotton ball-like propagules that include all the fungus, its partners, and associated microbes together. These propagules are dispersed into the environment, falling down the tree, blown short distances on the wind, attached to the fur of a passing animal, or splashed off by a raindrop. When it lands on a suitable place, it becomes lodged and establishes a new lichen that's presumably identical to its parent. So imagine how this process unfolds almost invisibly to us. It's too small to easily see, and growth occurs over years or decades, but also at scales that are inconceivable. A single lichen is constantly shedding hundreds or thousands of these propagules, thousands or hundreds of thousands of potential future lichens into its surroundings. So this is actually how they swamp the environment with vast multitudes of individuals, establishing a ready supply of partners that they need for the right moment when they have sex, and then at that moment are forced to resynthesize themselves, their partnerships from scratch. This is truly amazing, right? Like, I think we should all just stop for a second and just appreciate that this is completely insane, but also, and amazing. But also, you know, what happens when those pieces disperse just slightly further than maybe that one tree? You know, what happens when it allows a lichen to colonize a new tree, growing another identical community, or at least presumably identical community on that other tree? For lichens, you know, when that original tree falls down or dies and its lichen community is eliminated, does the lichen die if its clone is established on another tree? What is death and what is time? You know, what I presented here is a gross oversimplification, but it gives you a sense of the dilemma that these organisms really present for us. You know, under natural conditions, allowing processes to sort of unfold absent the contraction to disturbances at human timescales, these fungi have essentially limitless, non-linear, non-cyclical lives. They can be timeless and effectively immortal. You know, are they immortal? Yes, I think so. A mosaic of species, but what this means is that a mosaic of species of lichens growing on a single tree in a forest could reflect thousands or hundreds or thousands of years of events in the past, you know, all leading up to the moment that you see it, and then all moving forward from the moment when you walk away. And interpreting these communities offers this really unique opportunity. It opens this really unique window that allows us to experience essentially all of time simultaneously. You can understand the patterns of the past, the events of the past, by looking at the species and their abundances that occur there today. We can look at the realities of the present by understanding those exact same things, by studying those exact same things. And then we can also understand the probabilities of future events as we look at how those communities, those species, their abundances might change under future scenarios. So in this way, lichens, like fungi, such as lichens and mycorrhizae, are inherently queer organisms. They're non-homogeneous, not easily defined, non-linear, fluid, timeless, immortal. You know, in a natural world that's built around human-mediated conceptualized hierarchies, binaries, boundaries, life and death, heteronormative sex, and generational linearity, fungi challenge and defy our perceptions and impose paradigms. Within science, fungi have also been excluded, mischaracterized, others, analyzed within frameworks designed around heteroanthropocentric concepts of life, space, and time. This even extends to their basic storage in natural history collections, where despite their outsized importance and biological diversity, they are systematically neglected and under-resourced, forced into a non-existent space on the periphery of plant-focused botanic gardens, with which they're associated because of their historical perceived botanicalness, while excluded from other museums or collections due to their erroneous historical classification as botanical organisms. In reality, they are not plants, but they're also not animals. So where do they go? What do we do with them? You know, at this point, I think it should be clear that fungi defy traditional classifications and are often defined by contrasts and offer sort of unique perspectives steeped in multi-dimensional temporality. You know, lichens starkly illustrate our, oops, sorry, I don't know why that's not happening. Lichens starkly illustrate our impacts on the natural world, on biodiversity. They readily demonstrate the great reorganization that's taking place all around us, directly and indirectly at our hands. Their specialized, partner-based, collaborative, and community-driven lifestyle really makes them champions of responding to slow, steady change, but it also renders them particularly ill-equipped to change at the scales that we've now imposed on them. Human disturbance and pollution at scale, or rapid shifts in environment and climate, essentially result in the extirpation of lichens. Nowhere is this more evident than in dense urbanizations like New York City. So during the height of the air pollution in our area in the 1960s and the 1970s, the once diverse and abundant lichen communities here, they had really dwindled to sort of depauperate populations of fewer than 6 species that clung on in green spaces, sort of in the outer boroughs. And this was after the initial wave of urbanization, urban expansion, the imposition and expansion of the grid had already extirpated many species and reduced their numbers. Also, I apologize, there's like a whole bunch of beautiful photos of lichens in the city that are supposed to show up now, and I'm not sure why they're not doing that. Basically, lichens were extirpated from the city in the 1960s and the 1970s. And sulfur dioxide, which is one of the main harmful pollutants for lichens, it kills their photosynthesizing partners and then essentially starves them. And changes imposed by the Clean Air Act significantly reduced amounts of harmful air pollutants, so making New York City potentially habitable for lichens again. But they had already been entirely wiped out, essentially. So what had to begin was a decades-long process of recolonization that we are witnessing today. Cities are hotter, drier, and more frequently disturbed than surrounding natural areas. But the lichens that can survive in such conditions have begun to reinvade with this steady march into our urban surroundings, either because they were able to deal with the city already, or by finding new urban adapted partners that are able to survive here, or they have evolved themselves, the fungi, to adapt to these new conditions. Regardless, they've begun to return, and they grow in some of the most improbable locations. Again, it's really a shame that these pictures are not showing up because they grow on like rock walls everywhere. They grow on the like old sort of, you know, signs and fabrics and awnings of stores and things like that. I mean, it's just truly remarkable where these things will grow.
Do you want to take a second? Do you want to take a second to see if you can reboot them?
Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah. Okay.
Y'all get the idea. You know what a city looks like. Just imagine
we can Google it. Yeah, we can Google it. Well,
urban lichens.
I just have a quick question to insert here. It's like,
sure.
I've been watching, and I'm very into like these post-apocalyptic films and television shows, and the most recent is Station 9 on HBO, and it's Station 11, I think, and there's like little vignettes of human environments hundreds of years after the fall of civilization, and they're just covered in, you know, rust, the usual. Plants are growing all over, but from what I'm hearing from you, it really seems more like what would do the bulk of the colonizing, and the most important, effective, successful colonizing would be lichens and other fungi.
Yep.
And that's kind of like that in some ways, that's good news to me, that they are so hardy and they work in such long, deep time that, human activity, as dangerous as it is, as cancerous as it is actually something of a blip when it comes to like the time scale of lichens. How do you?
Well, it's a blip that just might kill all of them, right?
Well, so that's true too. Like, that's what I
so.
wanted to ask, is that if you look at, I know maybe I'm jumping ahead, but if you look at human beings as a kind of like antibiotic that was thrown onto the planet, maybe, if we don't get, we're not as effective enough, or it's like when you don't finish all the antibiotics and then whatever's growing inside you adapts to it enough to come back even stronger, and that's the danger of antibiotics. What would happen to the lichen population? Would fungi actually become stronger because they are forced to adapt to human presence? Like, how do you feel about that? What are your thoughts, hopes, and dreams?
I'm happy to share those thoughts. I think that what we see in urban areas is that the lichens have begun to recolonize. It's just that what's here now is not what was here before. It's radically shifted communities with different species and different abundances and different compositions. Yeah. And it's just like in everything else, right? Most things can't tolerate the changes that we are bringing to them. And a small number of things can. And those small number of things will probably survive into the future. And then they will evolve into some amazing diversity of things that we can't quite anticipate now. So I guess that's guarded optimism for long-term survival, but also I don't like to see the diversity and beauty of the world around me essentially destroyed.
How did they adapt to Chernobyl, for example?
Well, they can sequester. They can sequester all sorts of compounds and things. As fungi are amazing. They can do bioremediation and stuff. So they can recolonize those kinds of areas really when disturbance stops, and as long as it's not too polluted in ways that kill their partners. It takes a little while, but they'll recolonize most places. Just depends on what the scale of time will be. It's usually, it's often outside of our time frame. I mean, that's what the whole point of this talk is, right? Is that it's like these things are mostly beyond our scales. But at the same time, it's not beyond a sort of big picture time scale of geologic time. Mm-hmm. The whole point, though, is that, these lichens, especially in urban areas, fungi, but especially lichens, are really sort of, I think they serve as really good vehicles and frameworks to think about environmental justice. And because they're specifically very good at evidencing and sort of exposing systematic injustice and inequity, right? And at the same time, they can signal when things are actually changing materially, right, and effectively, like for the positive or the negative. They are essentially, indicators, that we call them bioindicators, but they're indicators of the health of the environment and of degree of disturbance and pollution. And so sort of their present in many ways is a way to inform environmental justice movements, but at the same time, they're a way to monitor and sort of actually gauge whether or not change has been successfully achieved or not. And so to me, that's really important. And that's something that we can easily, that is doable in cities. And I've worked with, at least one artist that was interested in kind of pursuing that. But I'm happy to talk about that more later. So, I will just, oh, that's weird. Why is this? There we go. Anyway, so I'll sort of end on the thought that one of the ways that we've begun to understand and dismantle our perceptions of sessile organisms like plants and fungi as these sort of static and immutable and unintelligent organisms is really through the recognition that they actually have their own forms of communication. They collaborate, they may even feel. And, for instance, there's all these sounds and signals in the natural world that have been made audible through bioacoustics. And that's sort of how we've learned that the universe has a rhythm, right? And people have gotten really attuned to this. We've, come to learn that plants respond to vibrations and they make some kind of vibration themselves. And detecting and really making the signals of fungi audible is something that people have been really interested in and have been doing, and has led to this sort of personification of fungi and of mycorrhizal networks as these really sort of dynamic, brilliant things that are truly beautiful, and that, you know, they're singing, right? Like, it's sort of like this beautiful thing about the world that these things exist and they are doing this. I would by no means, you know, say that that's not true. But at the same time, I think I'd have to ask whether, you know, in this time of sort of change and in reorganization that's happening at our hands and happening very rapidly, you know, is it really the case that these things are singing, or is it that they represent the collective screaming of all of the cells on Earth? You know, and I think with that, I will leave. I mean, will it come through? Oh, weird. Come on. I guess it won't work on my computer. Huh. Never mind. I had a sound of the fungi singing or screaming, as the case may be. Welcome to Wi-Fi, and I apologize for that.
That's okay. That's okay.
But with that, I hope that you've all sort of, you know, enjoyed this little exploration into the hidden realms of fungi, and I'm happy to take some questions and hear. I'm really interested to hear all of your thoughts. I know that a lot of this may be topics that y'all have not, you know, particularly heard or thought of or seen before, but I think it weaves really nicely in with your sort of environmental justice, ecology, sort of climate change direction of things that you're talking about. And, you know, I'd also just like to thank many, many, many people who have been supportive and sort of helped me develop these ideas and provided content along the way.
Yeah, it's like you have your own network here.
Yeah.
That communicates and interconnects and shares thoughts.
Fungi connecting, lichens connecting people. It's a Facebook group.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure Robert has many questions, but I have a quick one that you brought up. Jokingly, you said, you know, we tend to think of like these things as just being in a jar, right? And you go into a museum and you see them. And it's interesting because we were just really talking about this with James Mahan 2 weeks ago, discussing Descartes and another Enlightenment era figure.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, and we were talking about the subjectivity that humans have towards nature, that we're observing it, and it's sort of like behind a glass cage or a glass covering, and we can exploit it, we can use it, but we're really separate from it. We have souls and nature does not, including lichens and everything on up to animals, excluding us for some reason. There's like this you know, I mean, the reason is Judeo-Christianity, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that
that's a beyond me issue.
Yeah, that's not a you problem. That's a, you know, but my question is that we're trying to sort of move beyond that. That was sort of what we came to at the end of 2 weeks ago. And, you know, but at the same time, we're considering a museum audience, right, as who's going to be viewing this. And that can mean many things. It can be a large demographic, but I'm almost thinking like maybe this whole bell jar modality of the museum creates, or wherever it is, a gallery, whatever it is, creates this perception or this mode of subjectivity and this natural separation from the object we're observing. We're just observing and watching. We're not part of the situation. And this goes back to like Michel Foucault and like the medical gaze. This is really like the scientific gaze, I guess you could call it. And I'm concerned about that. Like, it's a very Enlightenment era thing, the scientific gaze. Yep. It's very related to Descartes and the Age of Reason. And I was wondering if you had some thoughts about that, about how we could subvert this scientific gaze that people have when they, or even just the artistic gaze they have when they go to see something like what we're proposing.
Right. Well, the challenge is always is always engagement, right? Like, I mean, and I mean, the museum was created to be sort of exactly that, right? To separate people from the thing. So you're viewing the thing. And you know, I think that's like a grand challenge of museums and the like today. You know, I guess in art, it's a little easier potentially to sort of draw engagement in, and like meaningful, real engagement, not just sort of like tactile, you know, like interaction. engagement and interaction are two separate things. You know, but the same thing can be done in a, you know, in a sort of observational museum framework, right? Like, sure, there's things in jars, but what if the things aren't in jars? And what if you're, you know, what if everything is actually interacting instead of in isolation? And I mean, the challenge is always, I think, you know, that we have as scientists and as sort of educators and you know, doing this kind of thing is we can see it, but it's hard to conceptualize and convey that to a person, right?
Yeah.
Especially people that haven't already been indoctrinated to the notion that these things all exist in this crazy interactive framework, and that it's really the interactions that are so much more not necessarily important, but what are really driving everything and what are key to everything.
Right.
You know, but it also that dialogues really nicely with a lot of the things about sort of how we as a society have to function moving forward if we're going to survive, right? And solve problems. Like everything has to happen through collaboration and community. It's not going to be single things working on their own. And the reality is that the world doesn't function that way, so neither should our society. You know, I mean, I think that just sort of starting from that premise of sort of undoing or deconstructing that very like isolated approach is the way to go about that. Visually, physically, all of that, interactively, there's ways of doing it. So I'm curious to see what you all come up with.
Yes, so are we.
I'm sort of wondering this, the part of the dilemma is this sort of implicit order and coherence in nature and mycelium and so on. That is, we kind of understand it, but we don't understand it at all. And then sort of the medium that we choose to understand it tends to be through some construct which really doesn't necessarily relate to that at all. And that seems like it's the biggest problem, is how to kind of participate in that understanding without impugning something on it. You know, it's a I was thinking, and that which brings me to another question, which is about specifically about fungi, that how, you know, the how do they, you know, how do they communicate? Like if you have a fungi that's in a distressed state or something like that, there seems to be some ability to for it to communicate, you know, to sort of send the signals out. What is the sort of medium, or how does that happen? Well, this is a technical question I'm kind of curious about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is to realize that all of these things are that fungi, especially mycelial fungi, are all interconnected together, right? So it's like, it's not just one thing. It's that there's all of this stuff interlaced together, and it's not just a single individual that has all its strings going everywhere. Instead, it's like this, you know, whole community of things that are linking communities of things together. And they are, you know, they are in very close proximity, and they're also linked to each other through other things, right? So, you know, more than one fungus might be attached to a single tree, and more than one tree will be attached to one fungus. And so it's like these networks, it's sort of like phone systems or something like that. I always hate like anthropomorphizing it and putting it into this sort of like, think of it as the internet or as a phone kind of thing, but it is kind of like that. You know, and so like there's signaling, you know, there are chemicals moving around in there that when things happen, there's biosignaling that's happening, right? I mean, it's probably no different than what's happening in our cells and other cells. You know, it's just that it's happening along these like highways of cells that are sort of just stringing everywhere together, and at like a really kind of crazy big spatial scale, right? Like this could happen over many acres. It's not just like a tiny petri dish area. Like this is huge areas that are all interconnected together, and huge amounts of the forest or whatever ecosystem it might be that are linked together in this way. I can send you some. There's definitely more stuff out there about sort of like signaling and all of that in fungi. I can send that, and plants and animals in general. It's really fascinating. Like, how does that happen? You know.
Yeah, and it's also invisible to us, and you know, like the internet's not invisible. Of course, the routing and the networking, that's beyond the layperson. But I mean, you can go to school for it. I did. You know, it's really boring, by the way. but you do it, and there are some interesting things about it, and it exposes the process at the very least, like IP addressing and routing and all that stuff, and where it came from and where it's headed. But the internet is like in our lives. We're suffused in it, and it's like creating, because we're all networked and communities are connecting to new communities. There are these things that are happening that are beyond us to control, like emergent behaviors, right? And we were talking about this as a class, I think, on our very first class, what emergence is. These networks of mycorrhizal networks and lichen fungal networks, is there any sort of, from your research, is there any sort of like emergent behavior that comes out of their networking together? Like almost like I'm skirting around like consciousness, but
right.
that's where I'm headed.
Well, that's like slime mold land, right? Where everybody thinks about how there's these slime molds, and the slime molds are,
is it a brain? You know?
Yeah, right. I mean, but that's like, those are sort of deep existential questions about like, what is intelligence, what is feeling, what is all of that, you know? I think that it's better to just stop and say, well, these things are doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And
they're and
changing
it's important.
And they change their landscape. I mean, they change the environment that they're in a positive way. For them, yeah.
Yeah. And they're, and also harming them is detrimental to them. So
because they're sort of living in their food.
Yeah. I think it's really the key thing is that we've, for such long periods, had this perspective that whatever we do is only impacting the thing that we immediately see it impacting. And we know that that's not the case with climate, obviously, but what cutting down a tree has to do, what impact that has on all the things that the tree is connected to, or that we're growing on the tree, that's sort of something that we don't really think about, and we certainly don't integrate into policy and management by and large. I think that that's very important.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a fascinating thing that, there is awareness of, for example, like you said, trees getting cut down. The 1-2 punch there is that you cut down a tree, and then there's less biomass absorbing CO2 from the environment. And that affects us negatively. But cutting down a tree is cutting down its own little ecosystem. And I feel like you shouldn't have to make an argument for how that's eventually going to come back to us via some elaborate butterfly effect. Like the rhetoric shouldn't have to be geared around humans.
I would agree, but that's how we do.
The impulse for a lot of forestry management or any kind of land management is often to kind of, sculpt it to sort of suit our needs and our aesthetics, and with the weather changes that are going on, we have these things, these microbursts that are coming through the forest that are devastating, and the impulse is, well, here we've got all this wood, it's suddenly all twisted up, and what do we do with it? Well, we could take it out and log it, or do this with it, or do that. But if you leave it there, it creates this incredible amount of browse material for all kinds of mammals, birds. It nurtures all kinds of plant forms. They're finding it actually retards the invasive species, and so there's the impulse, the offense that it causes is really totally our own perspective. It's nothing to do with what's actually happening in the system itself.
I think it's also important to highlight that you said for a second that you said, that you can go to school to like understand how the internet functions, right? Obviously, right. I don't know every like detail of that, and probably will never. But the point is that one can do that. Is it impossible to learn something comparable about mycorrhizal networks or any of these sort of relationships and interactions in nature? No, it's just that the reality is that we spend way more money on understanding how the internet works because we have a vested interest in it than we do on understanding those things. I mean, I sincerely believe that if you throw enough money at most things, you can figure them out. And it's just that we are prioritizing something over another thing.
Yeah, like Thank you, Adam Smith, right?
Yeah, it's Adam Smith's fault. It's not Descartes, it's Adam Smith. It's both of them. No, but I think that's funny though that it's the same. We put a man on the moon, and we've done it several several times, like 15 times or something like that. Like it seems like
Some
that
number, yeah.
some number of times. It's now meaningless to us in many ways, aside from our national pride, right? And the only reason to go back to the moon would be some sort of like reinstatement of that pride. It's all about pride. It has nothing to do, but it's cultural is my point. And that's kind of what Robert was alluding to, is that we look at refuse in the woods as being somehow icky. There's like an ick factor, but that again is just part of culture, right? It's like the English garden versus the French garden
And
aesthetic.
perception. It's
And
all
perception, yeah. Exactly. And you made an interesting point in your presentation about how fungi are essentially queer, right? They
There's a
do
huge
not
body of stuff about this now. Like
yeah,
it's all
never even I had never thought about that, and it was just so fascinating to me because of like, of course they are, and of course they don't fit. The real thing is that they don't fit our cultural perceptions in any conceivable way. You cannot make them fit the very square pegs that we have created for ourselves.
And that's not like some revolutionary thing that I've thought up. Like that's actually something that people have really thought about relatively recently, and it's pretty clear. Yeah, once you think about it, you're like, oh, duh.
Exactly. That's what I was like. Well, of course, it's stupid. It's stupid to think of it any other way, and not just stupid, but it's damaging, right? It's damaging our.
Yes. Yeah. But it's also interesting because, basically we're trying to understand these incredibly important and dynamic organisms, these things that are essential to the survival of us and our planet, but we're forcing our understanding of them into these constructs that they don't fit. I mean, when you're trying to analyze data using, like models and statistics and things that are built for animals
it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. Like I mean, sure, you can get some result, but our entire framework in biology is built around not this thing. And yet, at the same time, nature is full of these kinds of like violations of what our traditional sort of like heteroanthropocentric idea would be. It's not just fungi. There's any number of examples of it in nature. It's just that they happen to be a really high profile and pretty clear one.
So are they going to start trying to ban your book at school boards now? And
I don't know. I hope not.
Will I get sued in Texas if I start reading your book or anything? They're gonna sue me. There's a question here: Are the details of fungi's cap and general design demonstrative of environmental changes?
You mean the like actual structure itself, or?
I assume they mean that. Yeah, I assume like the morphology of it. I mean, the thing is, they all look. I mean, you showed us maybe 10, 15, well, a bunch, 20, but that's a very small amount of like the total. Yeah, it's a drop in the bucket.
And they're crazy.
Yeah, I've seen. There was one that looked like it looked disgusting, and then there are others that look so beautiful, flower-like in some ways, much more acceptable to our perceptions, right? But there's such a range.
I studied the ones that look like dust. So that was my entire PhD was the ones that look like dust. Nobody likes them, and they are
they're kind of gross. Yeah, but they're also beautiful in a way. But what accounts for all this this range, this sort of
but that's like, again, is fungi are full of these amazing, like really fascinating contradictions, right? Like it's like they form these amazing shapes and colors, and actually all of those structures that they form, they can be really specialized in what they do, and sort of like, some of them have like a cap that's attached to the stalk. Sometimes the cap like pops off. Like there's all of this stuff that they do. But the crazy thing is that it's all done with just these little strings that glue themselves together. Like it's almost like all of everything you see is made up of the same basic structure. There's no differentiation beyond just like, it's just how the strings are organized that results in whether the cap stays on the stalk or falls off,
So it seems that it's not that their morphology is not the macro morphology that we see when we see a mushroom lying on the ground and looks crazy to us is not so much for us. And it's just an emergent, and it doesn't even necessarily, it's not even a response to their environment necessarily, but it's just an emergent property that could or could not have a beneficial effect to them.
Well, it it's evolution in general is something that's, having some beneficial effect in some way to the thing that's doing it.
Or not non-beneficial,
right.
not, a detrimental. Yeah.
But there's a lot of, that's why you've got your basic form of the mushroom and your basic form of a puffball, and those things have happened multiple times. It's not like all puffballs are related to each other. The puffball has evolved multiple times, and mushrooms have been lost multiple times. It's the same thing in lichens. We have these growth forms that are the same as a tree, a shrub, and an herbaceous plant, but each one of those things, they aren't all related to each other. It's just sort of the growth form the thing happens to take. For one reason or another, depending on its evolutionary history and, how it's sort of adapted to change and the environment and the niche that it's developed to be in.
Okay.
This is big B, big E evolutionary biology.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because last semester I had a discussion with a Lehman faculty named Stephen Redenti, and he's studying the eye and the retina. And we had this exact same talk. About evolutionary biology and in confluence with intelligent design, that discussion, and how they're the culture wars around that, of course, they're legion. They go back hundreds of years, but I found it kind of fascinating to think about it just from a design perspective, even though there is this argument that even evolution by natural selection, even though it's a completely passive process, the way Darwin described it, is in itself a form of design, right? It's a design with a passive sort of motivation. And I find that if you look at it that way, leaving aside intelligent design, if you look at evolution as a kind of design process, the things that come out of it have meaning, right? So it's almost like looking at mushrooms and fungi as having some kind of meaning. And I think there's something there. It's what Robert and I have kind of been dancing around. Networks, that's obvious meaning to us. But even just the way these things look, and they're crazy looking sometimes to us, and other times they're very beautiful. I feel like that's something to explore somehow, Robert. I don't know.
Yeah, and is there a lot of documentation on evolutionary design in mushrooms? I think
there's a fair bit.
Recent, is it something that's been witnessed and documented in the last 25 years, where something is? They don't cross-pollinate really. That's not really sort of the process. But
hybridization, but
hybridization.
Exactly, that's what I mean. Yeah. Is there documentation of that kind of thing? So
there's work that's been done on that. Yeah. And there's actually, there's fungi that are model organisms. So understanding of, a lot of sort of fungal biology and things like that stems from an evolution, stems from sort of model organisms like Neurospora or Aspergillus or something like that.
So lichen that are on top of mountains that have been subjected to, when you get up above the tree line, you have all that lichen up there, and then it's been subjected to a acid rain. Is there some adaptation process, evolutionary design process that's occurred as a result of that, or is it just
what the lichens that occur at a given place are adapted to the conditions of that place. Over time, they have adapted to that. Whatever those conditions might be. It's just that those adaptations have presumably happened over a much longer time scale than 25 years. And also, it's not to say that the lichens aren't everywhere. They're actually everywhere. We just don't perceive them unless they're unless we're talking about urbanized areas or polluted areas or something where they're not as abundant. They're just different, and they're ones that we don't perceive, or the average person doesn't perceive as readily. Perhaps then you might, in a clearing on top of a mountain, or, on the coast of Maine or coastal California in a fog belt or something like that. But, that I guess the reality is that they're evolving these forms, right? And these forms just happen over and over again because it just seems to be the right way to do it. And I think in some ways, sort of the most interesting thing is that, we have these, the form ends up seeming to be the most elegant solution to the problem. But at the same time, when you break down how the form is made at a molecular level and, and it's sort of an evolutionary framework, often it's in the clunkiest and least straightforward way, right? So it's sort of evolution happens, but it's not necessarily the most sort of efficient and elegant process.
It's the least. It's the least.
Yeah.
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 It's like throwing a bunch of stuff against the wall and whatever sticks is the thing you go with. I mean,
whatever sticks survives.
That's what I mean by the, it's like really is a design process, because that's essentially what we're doing in this class. We are gonna we're talking to lots of different people, including you. We're coming up with all these ideas, which we're gonna talk about after we say goodbye. And then maybe like one or two of those ideas will actually bear fruit. And that's what we go with. So there's no real, it's not like we have an elegant solution. We arrive at it because we get rid of all the stuff that's not so elegant. The rough edges are going to get trimmed off.
Yeah, we're sort of in the desert right now.
Yeah. Are there lichen in the desert? There are, I bet, right?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, there you go. Okay.
The man arbor lichen.
Yep. Well, this has been, we blew through an hour. I don't know how we did it, but thank you so much, James. This has been incredible. Oh, and there's just one more question that maybe you could quickly answer. What are some great online communities to help identify lichen fungi we find in our communities?
You can use, INAT is something that a lot of people use, and it seems to be working better and better for lichens. And there's actually like communities of people, especially in New York City, who sort of routinely are paying attention to that.
What's it called? INAP?
iNaturalist.
iNaturalist. It's a website, I imagine.
It's an app. Yeah, you can get on your phone.
Oh yeah, I've used that. Yes, right.
A lot of people use it, and it has like an algorithm that does seem to work surprisingly well for some things.
You pointed at a thing, and
but
it'll
you
tell
like
you
take
what
a picture and you post it. It's kind of like a social media thing.
I was actually just talking about that yesterday, and we're doing a design class where we're creating an app, and I was talking about that app, and I was trying to think of the name. So thank you for reminding me.
Sure. I mean, that's the main thing. You can always, there's also like a lichens connecting people Facebook, but that's more of like a global thing and not a local thing.
Spun?
Yeah, well, they're like, aren't they the organization that's kind of for like increasing appreciation and awareness of the mycorrhizal networks? I've looked that up, but I forget exactly.
Yeah, and their big thing is that they're doing a global mapping, whatever that is, and how you do that. I think it's because there's such a massive assault in some areas and the disruption in these networks. I mean, just raising awareness. I don't think most people realize the disruption that a lot of traditional farming techniques cause. Once you start digging up the soil and tilling the soil, it just, you're such a
what does that disruption have on the, what does disrupting these networks have? What's the impact of that, right? Like that's the question. That's sort of the big unanswered question for so many of these things, is when we break these interactions, when we disrupt them, and when we like you play Yahtzee and you shake the thing and you just let all the letters back out onto the table. Like, what does the ecosystem look like when we do that? Like, how does it change? I mean, that's on the face of it, you would think that that's very easy to understand, and that's something that we would be everyone would know all about. But actually, it's really kind of difficult to tease apart, and in some ways, because there's so few ways to sort of conceptualize what the original state of things would have been like.
Right. Yeah.
Whatever that means. Original.
Yeah. Whatever that is. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, James. We look forward to keeping this conversation going through various ways. Because we have a lot more questions for you. But thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for coming. This has been fascinating. Go out and check out some lichens on your walk, wherever you're going. I will see you guys next week. We're going to be talking to a sound designer. So I think we're actually going to be talking about recording these sounds that are coming from different plants and lichens. Cool. That's an area of interest we were already kind of thinking about, but I think you really piqued our interest today about that. So thank you, everybody. I will see you everybody next week, and have a good weekend.
Okay. Thank you, James.
Yeah, of course. Have a good weekend, y'all.
Thank you, Robert. See you later.
See you later.